This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.
Welcome to today's meeting of the Fire Committee. On our agenda today is a discussion on the London Fire Brigade's culture. Before we begin, we have a few small items of business. Please may I remind participants to silence your devices. Members of the public may like to follow @London Assembly and use the hashtag Assembly Fire for this meeting. Now, can I ask the clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received today from Assembly Member Cooper.
Thank you. Can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members? Can I also ask members if they have any disclosable pecuniary interests in specific items listed on the agenda? Can we confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 10th of September 2024? Thank you. Can we note the completed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings and the additional correspondence received? Thank you. And can we note the response received from the London Fire Commissioner to the committee's letter regarding the London Fire Brigade's summer readiness? Thank you. Right, we're going to start. Thank you so much for our guests who are joining us. We now move on to the main item, a discussion on the London Fire Brigade's culture. And I'm going to welcome our first panel of guests. Susan McCarthy, from the who's an independent chair from the Fire Standards Board. Dr. Jessica White, Acting Director of Terrorism and Conflict Studies from the Royal United Services Institute. I love that title, it's great. Dr. Rowena Hill, Professor of Resilience from Emergencies and Disaster Science, a great title again, from Nottingham Trent University. And joining us virtually is Anne-Marie Barlow, who is the Director from Energised Development. Thank you all all for joining us today, and I'm going to kick off the first question, and that is to everybody who is in our panel today. Oh my God, let me just go through it. Thank you, got it. The first question is, what are the key challenges with improving the culture of a fire and rescue service? So do you want to start, Rowena, and then we'll work our way across?
Thank you very much. So I think from my perspective, my main area I think I've been invited here to talk about today and the perspective to give is the health and wellbeing aspect. So I've been researching the Fire and Rescue Service health and wellbeing as well as resilience for about the last 22 years. And just led the first national 2-year project into health and wellbeing. We know that culture and health and wellbeing and leadership of health and wellbeing are inextricably linked. You can't separate those out. We had to, in some way, in order to do the work that we've been doing with the National Fire Chiefs Council and the Firefighters Charity. But I think the aspects of health and well-being that are seen in a negative or a problematic culture have a flip side, that actually they are also protective factors when we look at the health and well-being and the maintenance of that within a healthy organisation. So I think as we go forward, some of the challenges that I would like the committee to consider is to look at the unintended consequences that sometimes arise when we focus on culture, because they can have an adverse effect sometimes on health and well-being. Not only in a more general sense across all organisations, that as soon as we have accountability measures such as our own, that puts pressure on the organisation, that also has, we can see, track that through to some differences on health and well-being, but also particularly with the watch culture of the Fire and Rescue Service. We know that when that is negative, it is negative, but we also know that's one of the biggest protective factors. That close co-worker network that provides social support is one of the biggest reasons and the biggest self-reported mechanism that people within the Fire and Rescue Service use to maintain their health and well-being. So I suppose one of the aspects that I'd like the committee to consider is just making sure that there's no unintended consequences from processes such as these.
Thank you. We'll be talking more about well-being, so do come in at that point as well. Our next guest, Jessica.
Yeah, I think I'll probably come at this from quite a different angle, which I think is hopefully useful to you, in that I've spent a lot of my research sort of backgrounds looking at the importance of considering intersectionality and considering sort of the dynamics that can lead to this type of culture. And I looked at it across different types of services, so looking at it in the military context, the police context, the fire brigade, and sort of what I've learned is that there's a history of a lot of these institutions that they've been set up and developed in a way that's quite blind to some of the inequalities that might exist within the service, right? So not thinking about sort of where gender inequality or racial inequality have been part of the history, the way that these institutions have been set up, because, you know, historically these might have been quite, you know, driven by one perspective of the person who can or is able to do the job, and that's often in, you know, Western culture been a white male, sort of able-bodied of a certain background, and that history has then made it challenging, I think, today for institutions to grapple with how they can change culture, because it is institutionalized. It's part of the way it's been set up, and it's been allowed for so long that when we today sort of think about how do we challenge this environment, how do we, you know, increase understanding within these services, within the people who might join these services of why they need to consider sort of the behaviors that might be allowed in some of these environments, why they need to consider how, you know, the sort of sexist, racist allowances that can lead to some of these cultural challenges. It's often embedded in the way that they feel that they have to behave in these ways in some cases to be able to perform the roles that they have to perform. and challenging that can be very difficult. So I think that there's a history there that probably sets up part of the challenge around how to change these cultures, because they are deeply embedded in the institutional understanding of what it takes to do these jobs and who has usually been allowed to do these jobs, and what we're asking of them today to change to allow in more diversity, to allow in more perspective, and that can then be challenging to these internal cultures. It can be threatening to the way it's always been done, to the understanding of how it should be done. And I think this probably leads into the watch culture element as well, that you see this across services, right? This is true in the military environment, this is true at police commands, that when especially, I think especially, and this is probably especially true in the case of the fire service, that when there are small, tight-knit units that exist in quite an independent way, right? They exist within a structure, but they are commands level driven at a very, tight-knit small way, that it then becomes very discretionary to that command structure as to how they enforce an understanding of what culture should be. And there can be a big discussion, a high-level discussion within a service, within any of these services, about what that culture should be and what changes need to be made, but filtering that down then to these very local, one person sort of in charge of a family unit, a tight-knit structure, that it's then up to the discretion of that person as to how they enforce that. And that can be more difficult to navigate if you have, some of these commands level, smaller, more local commanders that understand less the reasoning why they should care, that understand less how to do it, how to enforce change, that understand less how to navigate the very difficult sensitivities of how to address this, within their command structure in a way that can be heard and accepted, that it then becomes very unequal in the way that these culture changes can be enforced. So I think that's probably another challenge that needs to be considered, of sort of how to ensure that this high-level discussion about what needs to be changed can filter down to the very local sort of watch structure elements of the fire service.
Thank you. I mean, gosh, that's he really does put across the challenge, especially in terms of that embedded behaviour and systems that are already in place. It's going to be so difficult to change. But thank you that we hear you, Suzanne.
Thank you. As you can imagine, I come to this question from a fire standards perspective, and from my perspective, what you need to do in the key challenge for cultural change is in relation to ensuring good senior leadership. To me, that's the fundamental challenge to ensuring that you get the cultural change you want in a fire and rescue service. There are certain standards that are crucial to achieving this, and therefore you as a local authority would want to ensure that they were being implemented and implemented successfully. And I'm referring specifically to leading the service, leading and developing people, the Code of Ethics standard, which supports the Code of Ethics itself, communications and engagement, and safeguarding. They all very readily contribute to cultural change if implemented successfully in a fire and rescue service. And I have seen that and heard about that from other services that I have visited throughout England. We have a suite. We have just finished the initial suite of 19 standards. And all of them, in fact, work together to create a culture that is actually helpful to the community and to the professionalism of the service itself. So we do not suggest that you're going to get culture change by one standard alone. You need to see it as an actual holistic body of work that will help them to develop their professionalism and therefore help the community they serve. And that's what my recommendation is your challenge.
Thank you. You started off with also that need of that leadership and that being such a key for the change that's needed. Thank you. Online we have Anne-Marie. Your thoughts on the key challenges?
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. So my thoughts on, in terms of recommendations, relate to how we can help the service and I guess the wider sector feel safe to change. In particular, because there's been growing interest, from the public and the media in terms of particular incidents or cultures that have come through as negative, I guess. But I think it's really hard to change an organisation when there's so much scrutiny and so much public interest and media interest. And I think what that sometimes leads to is an environment where it's not okay to fail or get it wrong. And clearly, when there's really awful things that happen, we do need to address that. But certainly from my experience working with a few blue light organisations is that it can feel really hard when you get it wrong because there's so much scrutiny and interest. I also think looking at the angle that Ofsted's taken recently on inspection and grading type reviews. My background's public sector, but my background isn't the blue light sector. And what I noticed coming into this environment is that it's very inspection based and it can feel quite overwhelming. But also it can feel quite tokenistic sometimes when it comes to culture because it's part of an inspection environment rather than a leader saying, do you know what, there's some stuff happening here that we're not happy about and we need to change that. And I think you're probably not happy about it. So as a workforce, how do we deal with that? So my recommendation would be, how do we help people feel safe to change and take ownership for change?
Thank you. It's such an important point about that media impact and how that public image is so important, and gosh, how do you fail? You know, how is it okay to fail in these situations when we've had such a some horrific things that have happened within the Fire Brigade and other institutions, and failure sometimes is just too much, isn't it? So thank you so much for raising that. We're moving on to our next set of questions with Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. White, if I can come to you first. So you were just speaking about intersectionality and the inequality that exists throughout so many of our systemic oppressions or systemic kind of structures that then create oppression. Are there specific things to the Fire Brigade that it can learn from the other blue light services and the military, or is it very much its own context?
I do think that there are things that they can learn from each other, sort of learn from the processes that are happening across many of these services in today's context. There are things that are different. The mandates of these organizations are different in that, you know, the police, the military are enforcing a sense of either domestic or international, enforcement, which gives them perhaps slightly different culture, but in looking at areas where they can overlap and where they can learn from each other, I think we definitely saw that there are elements of this that are true across these services, right? It's not a security environment that applies in exactly the same way to the London Fire Brigade, but they play a role in sort of this protection element. And I think that's where they can learn from each other, and they can learn, I think, some of these lessons around addressing culture, around how to do it. We certainly found that when you're thinking about recruiting, for example, sort of that this can become a vicious cycle, right? This culture issue, because if you want to encourage diversity, if you want to encourage a positive culture in your service, you need to bring in more diversity, which often is lacking in many of these services. But nobody who is from a diverse background wants to come into a service where they feel that they're not going to have a good experience, right? So then it becomes a difficulty of you need recruitment, but you can't get recruitment of the kind that you want to get that would help diversify the service, and it becomes quite a challenging cycle. So I think that's a similarity across the services that are trying to deal with this culture issue, that they can think about how to adjust the public-facing image, how to address the public-facing challenges of these culture issues, acknowledging that they exist, but sort of setting a plan for how they can address it, how they're trying to address it now to make it more appealing to invite people in. I think there's an element of, internal jurisdiction, internal governance that's quite similar across the services, where I think it absolutely is important to have these key senior leaders who believe in this mission. But I've seen, especially in the military environment, that this middle management level is often also, you need them to buy in, because they are the ones that are sort of the day-to-day touch points for a lot of the people that are perhaps, caught up in these challenging cultures, and you really have to get that buy-in across the structure of the institution. And I think that's similar across the services. I imagine probably one more point that's similar is thinking about as people get out of the services and sort of the impacts of people who have been in the service for a very long time and hold a voice as a veteran of the service, and really understanding sort of their perspectives, their challenges, and understanding how the voice of that veteran community from the fire service does impact still the current community, right? They hold a lot of weight, and that would be a similarity, I think.
And presumably there's a challenge there in terms of how you still hear those veterans, but also sometimes have to oppose entirely what they're saying.
Yes, yeah, and then veterans might have a sense of, I did my service, I did my time, I have a right to speak about this, but they might speak about it from a perspective that is contrary to your goals of your cultural change. So you have to learn to, I think, manage that in a way that doesn't deny them the voice that they are due, but allows it to take place within a conversation of change, a direction of change. And that can be a difficult thing to do. I don't have a perfect solution to that, but it's something that I think needs to be considered.
I was hoping the perfect solution was coming at the end, but you talked about the challenging cycle, and so when we think about something like racism, the Met Police last month said they want to be an actively anti-racist organisation now. Is there something that the London Fire Brigade, do you think, could learn from this kind of anti-racist approach?
Yeah, I think it's important to be anti-racist, of course. It's important to address the racism that does exist within the services, to not deny that there is a history of sort of a certain perspective being the majority perspective of the service. I think it's important, especially for the fire service being distinct to the police, and that there is the fire service has the ability to, I think, integrate into the community in a different way than a police service does, because a police service is there to enforce the law, whereas the fire brigade is there to rescue people from a burning building, right? It allows a sense of community engagement, of openness with the community. They're often out in the community, and there's not a connection to enforcement with the fire service. So I think it is probably less a matter, perhaps, of having to be openly, we are going to be anti-racist, but more about sort of ensuring that the outward view of the service is very diverse. It encourages that diversity, encourages that intersectionality, because I think there's quite an opportunity with the relationship that exists between the fire service and the community, and it just needs to be presented in a way that is obvious, sort of making it part of the engagement that they already have with the community.
Amazing. And then internally, in terms of being anti-racist, how much does the effective complaints process play into that, so particularly for officers from global majority backgrounds?
Yeah, this is a challenge across the services, right? We know that there are complaint systems in place in the military, for example, around sexual assault, but sexual assault continues to happen, right? That there has to be a process, and it has to be a process that has multiple access points. So you have to be able to enter into that process in a way that you can identify yourself if you want to, or a way that you don't have to identify yourself if you don't want to, because I think that's often a challenge in changing cultures, right? That you ask the people who are the target of the negative culture to speak up. They have to be the ones to be the voice. And that is an impossible position to put them in, right? That you ask the minority individuals of whatever, or the sort of marginalized individuals, to be the ones that have to make the change. And that's not a fair system. So I think to really consider if there is an internal governance procedure that allows access for everyone in a way that they can choose whether to identify themselves as part of that process or not, that they have touch points to different levels of management in a way that if it is their direct commander that they feel is part of the problem, that they have somebody else that they can go to. And I think it comes down to reflecting back then that there's something being done. Because if you're a person that has to submit a complaint into a system and you feel that there's nobody hearing what you're saying, then that will be a push towards a more negative, a more grievance viewpoint, right? That you have to feel that you're being heard, that you're being considered equally, that that there's a process that's taking place, and that you're aware of what's taken place in response to your issue.
And particularly, you might have distrust of the entire system, so not even just your direct manager, but if you're from a marginalized community, it feels like the whole system, because of the inequalities you were talking about, is all set against you.
Yes, absolutely.
Makes sense. Anne-Marie, can I bring you in here online? It's just to ask the same questions, really, particularly around an anti-racism strategy for the London Fire Brigade.
Okay, so I guess very similar in that it needs to feel like there's multiple access points. It can't feel that you can only rely on your manager or your manager's manager, particularly if those are the people that, even if they haven't intended to display those behaviours, something I've come across working in these types of organisations is that banter is part of the culture, and there's a fine line between not wanting to, we don't want, I think the term banter can be really hard for people on the ground doing these jobs, because that's how you get through a really difficult shout, is that you can have a sense of humour sometimes about something you saw at the weekend, or you can give each other a bit of a ribbing people would talk about. But when it comes to that line between, could somebody be hurt by what we're saying, or is this offensive what we're saying, there's a very different line. And I think that's where most people know that line, most decent people know that line, but there are the kind of people that will cross that line, and that's a more, I guess, targeted approach. So my recommendation would be to absolutely agree, make sure there's multiple access points, but also to make sure that we aren't alienating people by, in one organisation I've worked with, it's a zero tolerance on banter. That's not going to happen. You're not going to achieve that. And what we want to say is we want you to be humans at work, and we want you to have, time together to let off some steam, but we don't want that to be at the cost of somebody else's health at work or in the community.
And can I ask Anne-Marie, it might be too general, but are there organisations where you know that they've got this right, or they've managed to navigate some of the difficulties around, I guess, free speech versus banter is probably not quite the right divide, but that kind of area where they've managed to navigate it in a successful way?
It's really difficult to talk about clients, but certainly if I think generally, I think organisations that do this well are the ones that aren't afraid to say it's okay to be yourself at work, but you need to understand there are boundaries within that. And I think probably what's been most interesting to me in my work is that when you get into these conversations, particularly with watches or similar environments, actually the fear of getting it wrong is much greater than actually, other people. That's been my experience, is that people have felt far worse and far more anxious about getting it wrong and being cancelled than it has been about people genuinely feeling there is an issue within that team. But that's, a couple of organisations I've worked with. I couldn't talk about the sector as a whole.
That's really helpful. And then just leading on from there, the toxic watch culture that you just alluded to and has been spoken about, are there particular recommendations you'd have for the brigade on how to tackle that kind of culture?
Yes. So I'm just going back to my notes on watch culture. So I think what's been most interesting for me is that you've got people, it's really normal for people to be working together who started their career, their very first job almost in this environment, and somebody who joined 6 months ago. And so you really do have that multi-generational workforce thing going on. And so we have that in society. We're not all going to have the same outlook on life. We're not all going to have the same experiences. So I think that's a real challenge in terms of you don't necessarily, unless you have worked within another, on another station or another, somewhere else in the country, you tend to work in the same environment with the same people for a really long time. So I think that's really important to recognise. But also there's family history, particularly in rural communities, where not only are you representing yourself, you're representing your family, where generations of your family have volunteered or have worked at the same station. I've seen it in other organisations where you're also representing your community. So, you're volunteering because you care about the people in your village or the town that you live in. But when these organisations become bigger and perhaps they, you combine authorities or something like that, the strategic need is important and in terms of the direction's important. But when it comes down to the heart of it, the people that sit on that watch are probably there for the same reasons, that they care for the people in their town, or their family have done this for a really long time, or they've been here for a really long time and they really care about it. So I think that's a huge challenge when it comes to watch culture. The other thing that I think is a big challenge is back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of middle management, because what I've seen through the promotion process is that people are promoted into senior roles, yet I don't know if we do enough to help them take a step away from that family environment and feel that they can be part of that family and support you when you've had a tough shout, but also take a step out of that and be prepared to make tough decisions and perhaps unpopular decisions.
Thank you. I'm going to have to just wrap that section up, but thank you very much. Assembly Member Tyrrell, and we are going to try and speed up this session as much as we can. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could direct this to Dr. White, please, which is, are there any learning points that the Fire Brigade, the London Fire Brigade, can get from learning how to build up confidence in their complaint system for other organisations that you can think of?
Yeah, I'm not sure how effectively I can answer that question. I do think that there probably is useful, and having put sort of some representatives of fire services and sat them down with police services and then military services, that they're surprised by what they can learn from each other. I think there's often not these conversations, and I'm sure there are other services that are similar in nature that could also, add to that conversation. I think all of them, unfortunately, still struggle with how to implement a really effective process for this. I do think there's been learning, especially perhaps in the military space, because there's such a demand for the need for these systems to be in place, and it's maybe been in place somewhat longer. I don't know if that's true or not, but sort of in a more systematic way over a longer period of time. So I think that there are probably things that they can learn from each other and what has gone well and what hasn't. I know sort of from I served in the military prior to becoming an academic, and a big element of it was clear and sort of became very clear in the need for these systems, that the system has to be in place, but there also has to be in place a commitment to awareness raising about the system, and not the kind of awareness raising where everybody goes to a mandatory training once a year and sits and kind of jokes about the fact that they have to be there and they don't want to be there on a Friday afternoon or whatever it is, but a real commitment to ensuring that everybody respects the system, that there is an understanding of why we need the system, and that it is not a joke, that it is a serious part of the service, and making sure that the service is representing everybody evenly.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm really fascinated by the point you mentioned the military, because actually my younger days I was in the Army Cadets, and a lot of the instructors from there actually were also in the Fire Brigade where they were, and again you can see the cultural similarities between the two. But going to Anne-Marie now, what should the metrics of success for cultural change look like in a large complex organisation like the London Fire Brigade?
Okay. So I think it's really great that we have stuff like staff surveys and feedback forms. You'll find them in lots of organisations, but I think it's really important on top of that to think about that qualitative data as well. So when we talk about storytelling, lived experiences, people feeling comfortable to be able to share what life is like for them, but also is there something about those conversational elements between the leadership of these organisations and colleagues? I think they're far more powerful when it comes to what's it really like to work here. So one of the questions that I'll often ask when I'm doing culture work is, how do you think you need to behave to belong here? And that can often prompt a really powerful conversation. I think also it's worth bearing in mind, and we quite often forget this, is that data gathering in itself is an intervention. So how we gather data can can contribute to culture too. And when I've talked with organisations, particularly my work with a fire service was around, we don't want culture to feel like this HR-y thing. We want it to feel like something we're all interested in. And so it's really important to break down, trying to avoid even using the word culture sometimes, and break it down into tangible things that people can talk about. I think that's really helpful. The final thing I'd like to say about metrics is that my recommendation would always be to do less but do it really well. And I think very often we can be blindsided by culture change programs that have a budget attached to them and they're program managed, and that's great. But when it comes to change fatigue, very often change fatigue happens because people don't see the unresolved issues being dealt with from the past, or what we've just been working on before we're thrown into something else. So I think it's really important to measure well, but also before we move on, know that we are in a good place to move on.
Thank you so much. We're on to our next set of questions on standards in fire and rescue services. Assembly Member Clark.
Thank you. Suzanne, you won't be surprised these questions are for you. You touched on earlier about revising your standards on service people and development and safeguarding. I'm just wondering if you could just talk us through the impact that's had.
Well, at the moment, I have to say that standards have in their outcome statement, every standard has an outcome statement which explains what good looks like. And then you go on in the standard to see how to achieve it, and that's principle-based, because we recognize that services have different demographics, different geographics. So how, for example, the London Fire Brigade would be able to achieve the outcome statement might be different than possibly somewhere, a service in Devon or in Cornwall or in Manchester. In looking at how standards might be able to achieve what you want to, which is a good service for the community and a service that internally is productive and efficient and effective, I have to say that Andy Cook, in his latest State of Fire report, actually saw that services, and I'm quoting here, that have adopted and implemented the standards will find themselves better set up for our inspections. And I think that's the important thing, to see standards and inspections not as two different things, but actually trying to achieve the same, because the action plans which the London Fire Brigade or any other service should put in place should be holistic. It should be looking at the recommendations from inspections, seeing if they use the implementation tool that goes with every standard, including leading the people and leading the service, where the gaps are. The interesting thing about those two standards is the fact that, unlike other standards like prevention or protection or emergency driving, they are across the entire service. You would expect that the senior team and the fire commissioner, in your case, would be leading on that or want to be responsible for that, and to see it as an entire general requirement for the whole service to be engaged. Others might be much more specific, as I said, like prevention, protect, and safeguarding. We've completed the first suite, as I said, of 19 standards. There may be others, but no, we're not a Ford Motor Car company. We're not out there just to create standards. And what we're doing now is turning our attention to looking at the benefits of standards. And we're doing that with our colleagues in the Inspectorate and in the National Fire Chiefs Council, because we've just been talking about data, and data is important both quantitatively and qualitatively. And so I have to say I have personally visited a lot of services, and what I'm hearing now is different from what I heard 3 or 4 years ago, which was, what do we put our time and money for? Is it the inspections recommendations, or is it the standards that we have to put in place? Now we're hearing standards help us do a better job, and when the inspections come, they can see that we have improved. So what I would warn against in relation to your question about leading the service or leading and developing people or any of the other standards is to ensure that the fire and rescue service is in fact not taking a tick box mentality. And if we try to ensure that reflection is what we want them to do in relation to a compliance approach. And if they do that, because firefighters and their staff are very good at having a problem and seeing how do we get there to solve the problem. We would like much more reflection, and we also want a return to reflection. So it isn't, oh, everything has been done. Our gap analysis shows, our implementation tool shows we have got everything in place and we don't have to look at this again. In fact, it's a continual cycle of a review, reflection, and hopefully improvement. So I hope that answers your question.
It does, but then I just wanted, so review, reflect, improve. I think that would be the gold standard. But if we're thinking about standards and we think about inspections, with reflecting and just sort of going wider than what could possibly be the standard, how can you judge that, or how can you look at reflection, and how can you look at that sort of holistically?
Well, I can only say that we have different roles. The Fire Standards Board role is to identify, produce standards, publish standards, and maintain standards. We are not a regulator. We are not a monitor, though we do want to find out the benefits of standards and their consistent application. I have to say that one thing I noticed when I was recently at the National Fire Chiefs Council's Autumn Conference, which I spoke at I think it was last week now, we asked those attending for 3 words which described how they felt about standards. We also asked them what their favorite standard was, which caused laughter. I hope it was mine. But what they kept saying was consistency of approach, that it didn't matter where you were in this country of England, you would get the same level of service from the fire and rescue standard service that your community was giving support to, because the standard was implemented properly. The inspectorate also doesn't have a monitoring job. It is inspecting, and it doesn't audit standards, but obviously, as you've heard, it takes account of standards. It's actually you guys, the local authority, that has the power and the ability to hold your fire commissioner and the service to account. And the issue there is, another thing we do is obviously consult when we're putting out a standard of how long will it take you to actually implement this. And what they always say is, we want to implement it, but we don't have the resources to do it as quickly as we want. So you may require them to do something. You may say, you need to implement this, but if they aren't able to do so, or they don't prioritize it, they're not going to do it. So I have to put back to you that you are the ones that can make standards implementation in your service possible.
Thank you. I'll hand back to you now, Chair, so we can move.
I found that absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. That was really, I've been scribbling notes. But we are going to move on to our next section, which is on mental health provision, and with Assembly Member Polanski.
Thank you, and you're right, super fascinating. I'll do my best not to get too drawn in. Dr. Hill, if I can come to you. So you wrote a report in March 2023, I think, with 31 recommendations. Could I ask how you think the Fire Brigade have been doing, particularly in mental health and wellbeing, since the publication of your report?
Thank you. So with regards to London Fire Brigade, I don't know. You'd have to ask them. Sure. I can talk nationally overall. We are in contact with many different fire and rescue services who are implementing that in the way that they need. So we were very conscious when we wrote that report that they, similar to the fire standards, kind of caveat that they are in different positions. They have different geographies, they have different demographics, they have different resource packages and envelopes. So we were very well aware that their governance structures differ, and that influences how they might take that up. With regards to how we put that report together, we did include a really robust consultation with stakeholder groups across the sector, across different services and across different levels, but also crucially across different occupational pathways within the Fire and Rescue Service. Traditionally, mental health research has focused particularly on operational staff, and it's been effectively traumatologists. And I say that, you know, having started off as that in my early career. But actually, the profile of needs is changing in our fire and rescue services. And so what we wanted to do was capture that and make sure that we had a good representation across the UK in order to create that report.
Thanks. And can I ask about the adoption of the NFCC Health and Wellbeing Framework?
Yeah, so that one's only just been released. So what we did with the report, with the 31 recommendations, we knew that there's different stakeholder groups in that. So some of those recommendations for individuals, and that was particularly around our own individual accountability, enactment of health and wellbeing within ourselves. There was also a set of recommendations that went to services, a set of recommendations that were aimed at kind of national coordination, so the National Fire Chiefs Council and also the Firefighters Charity, who were co-funding and certainly good sponsors of that work. And then also some of those other engagements bodies, so for example the Home Office and the Inspectorate. And so the framework, we've again had a good uptake on that. Mostly I'm cited on what's happening at national level, so particularly around the governance structures, around the data structures, because we have inconsistent data that doesn't allow us to have any form of strategic foresight. So in that needs analysis profile change that we see over time, and we also see over length of service, and we also see over different types of roles. We don't necessarily have that oversight. So certainly that's kind of where most of my my knowledge around how that is being implemented and the ways in which that framework is being used. Certainly when similar to Suzanne, a lot of the conferences that I've spoken to, there is a lot of interest. So we're working with different fire and rescue services across the UK in looking at what their individual needs might be in order to kind of close the gap for the gap analysis. We all like a gap analysis, don't we? To try and figure out. But it was very much principles driven because of the restrictions on those resource envelopes. We couldn't say, you know, everybody needs an overarching clinical psychologist, but actually they need peer support in order to deliver that support, because that's the most effective, because not everybody's got the budget. And so they were more principles of organisation and principles that were around using evidence-based interventions. It was around a holistic package, so looking at somebody not just as a work resource that has work challenges, but actually they have a work-life domain. And also, and the two are kind of bi-directional in their impacts. But also looking at that holistic aspect of physical, psychological and social health. And that's where that sense of belonging, that sense of I'm part of the Fire and Rescue Service, my pride in my role, and actually that they care about me and want me to be a flourishing human being, that kind of more holistic sense of that. But also holistic across the career and also holistic across those different job roles.
Fantastic. And just finally, can I ask you about the misconduct and grievance kind of procedures? So where an officer's been complained about, do you think there's adequate mental health support for those officers who have had a complaint about them?
So I haven't seen any data on that, so I wouldn't necessarily be able to answer in specifics. More generally, certainly from my work across different fire and rescue services, policing, our health sectors, suggests that that's something that I'm asked about very frequently. Should we do this? Is it a good thing? My answer would be, ethically, I don't understand why we wouldn't do that. I don't think we can, particularly, you know, sitting here as the author, the kind of primary principal investigator of that report. If we're saying that we're taking a holistic, preventative, proactive approach to well-being, then how can we not offer that in those situations? But the other aspect as well is when we talk about that kind of holistic approach, that we don't just want people to be well for work, but we actually want people to be well to live a happy and engaged life. Because surely, philosophically, that's what we want our public services to be mindful of. Then actually, even if there is a grievance situation that we feel may have some complexities there. A lot of the time, and very frequently, that comes with a very complicated set of personal situations. That means that somebody is either under undue stress, either from that situation itself, or that situation has evolved because of a very complicated situation. Then actually, surely, our duty of care would be to make sure that that individual has that support.
That's really clear. Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair.
I really appreciate the time that our guests have given today, and it has been absolutely fascinating. If there is any last comments that you do want to make, please do now. Otherwise, we will be writing to you, and if there is anything that comes to mind, please let us know that you feel like you wanted to clarify or to emphasise in terms of recommendations. If there isn't anything right now, yes, brilliant, yes, we've got a couple of comments.
So I think for me it would be I've been around the blue lights for a long time, and I think some of the errors I see are also the biggest opportunity. And my strapline is, just because they share a colour of a light doesn't mean that they're a homogenous mass. And I haven't heard anything here that has set my alarm bells off, but I think sometimes it's around where we can go for learning that isn't necessarily led by that statement. So the critical occupations are a good cluster group for research purposes, for some of that shared learning, but actually going wider and lifting our horizons up and out rather than to those people who are also in the press, I think sometimes is a conversation contour that I want us to break through a little bit more frequently, I think.
Thank you, Jessica.
I think going back to the point about unit and then impact on the mental health even, but something that's true across the services that I've looked at in the research is that point of unity building within a service, whether it's fire services or police or military, that's it can be a point of strength, and it can be a point of weakness or of danger, in that it is often in that process of building the in-group of the unit that you need for a service to operate effectively and have each other's back. That is also where all of this cultural challenge can enter, all of that toxicity can enter, and in forming the in-group of a unit, you then out-group everybody else that doesn't fit that in-group structure. And that's sort of, that comes back to what I do on a daily basis more regularly. That's where the extremism can enter the situation, right? Where sort of, because there is this sense of in-group, out-group, and you need that unit building for all of these services, that's the point you really have to be careful with, I think, of not allowing the toxicity to enter part of being a fundamental part of that unit building structure. And if it is already a fundamental part of that unit that is being built, then you have to really return to how to disentangle this unit from its sense of toxicity, or in its sense of cultural sort of misalignment with the institution. And that's a very granular, challenge, but it's also a huge element of all of these services that you need it, but you also have to be careful with it, because it can be the point of entry or allowance for that negative culture to build.
Well, thank you so much. We do have one last comment. Yes,
I had a comment as well.
Sorry. Yeah, and sorry, Suzanne. Sorry. Yeah. Suzanne.
Is it me? Okay. It's not really a comment, it's more a recommendation, which is that I know that we sent to you our review from last year. I don't know if it was actually taken and filleted and you only got little snippets, or whether actually you have the full one in your pack. But it does give you a full understanding of where the Fire Standards Board and Fire Standards have come from, what they are doing now, how we're working with the Inspectorate. And so you might find it useful as background reading to understand the comments that I've made. And you might look at our website, which obviously has all the standards on it, including leading the service, which I think is pivotal and crucial to your consideration, and leading the people, because it picks up all these issues about diversity, about mental health, about what a good service will do and have in place. So I just recommend that as bedtime reading, maybe?
Well, I think we will be all reading that. Thank you. Anne-Marie, just if there is anything, that's fine. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for everyone's contributions today. Absolutely fascinating. I do hope that you'll come again if we ask, because you have been excellent guests. You're very welcome to watch the remainder of the meeting from the public gallery if you wish, although I think some of you need to go, but thank you so much. We will adjourn. I'm going to push for 5 minutes, if that's okay with everyone, so that we can change panels for our next session. Thank you very much. Welcome back to the London Assembly's Fire Committee. We now move on to our second panel of guests. Welcome to Gareth Cook from the London Regional Organiser, who's from the Fire Brigades Union, Adam Shaw from the London who's a London Regional Treasurer, also from the Fire Brigades Union. We are just waiting for Anna Snelson from the London Fire Brigade Women in the Fire Service, Deborah Riviere-Williams, Chair of the London Fire Brigade Unison branch, and joining us virtually is Paula Lyons, who's the Company Secretary for Women in the Fire Service. Thank you so much for all of you coming today. Some of you are already listening to the previous panel where we were talking about mental health. So my first question is going to be on that continuing theme, and it will be to all of you. I'm happy to go along from Gareth on that way round, if that's okay, and then we'll end with online with Paula. How would you assess the wellbeing support offered to firefighters in the fire and rescue services, and how does the London Fire Brigade compare with other fire services?
Okay, well, morning everybody. Thanks for having us as usual. Mental health, right, this is very, I kind of want to set a little bit of a background picture to this, having done nearly 3 decades in the fire and rescue service now. We are in probably some of the most interesting times any of us have been in societally. The last 7 years alone, we've had the Grenfell Tower tragedy, we've been through a global pandemic, we've had cultural reviews, and the pace of change has been quite dramatic, to say the least. On top of that, we have communication channels now that were never there when I joined. You had 4 days off from your normal shifts of almost clearness and clarity and separation between work and home, which you don't have now. There's a constant bombardment of information coming both from the employers, even from us, from the Fire Brigades Union, coming from society. So it's very hard for somebody joining the fire and rescue service now to have some space to do that reflection, which one of my previous colleagues spoke about, and that reflective piece is very, very, very important. So with regards to mental health provision, we're in a strange place because, in my opinion, we are giving people a lot of information, but we are not giving people any education. So we're talking to people about their mental well-being, their mental health. We're saying that it's okay to not be okay, but then we're failing to teach them how to be okay. We're failing to give them their own personal accountability for how you make sure that you are well in the world. Because to be a rescuer, you can't basically get yourself in a position where you need to be rescued as much as you can. You have to be in a position where you hold yourself well. You need to be professional. You need to make sure that you're psychologically well, physically well, and that you're able to bring your best self to work to ensure that your colleagues' physical and emotional safety is there also. Now, one thing I will say to you is, having been a middle manager as well, some of the stress of the last 7 years alone applied to some of our really quite strategic leaders has, to a degree, created an environment where it's not okay to fail, as has been mentioned. There's constantly another crisis on the horizon. There's constantly a feeling of being scrutinised and a feeling of, I can't get it wrong. Now, in order for us to learn from one another, we need to be able to be open with one another, and we need to know that we can get it wrong. We need to know that we're not going to be cancelled for saying the wrong thing, for asking the wrong question, for learning from each other, for understanding what it takes to be a cohesive team is to understand what everybody needs in that team, alongside the boundaries, the policies, procedures that are set to ensure that we deliver the best possible service to the public. A bit of a long answer, I know, but I could sit here for hours with you all and talk about this one. In terms of the mental health care and health and wellbeing provision, I think the London Fire Brigade, with its counselling and the way that it's moved itself forward in a number of ways, including peer support, is fantastic to see. But there's still quite a lot of distance to travel. And we have to be very careful that our operational compassion and the way that we deal with the people of London and its visitors, we need to be really careful about making sure that we apply that same level of compassion and care to ourselves as staff and employees, trade union members, because only then can we sort of grow from one another and catch up with some of this societal change that's moved so quickly.
Thank you. I mean, you really are feeding from that last session that we were just hearing about not, being okay to fail. Adam.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I know LFB are doing. And one of the latest things that hasn't come live just yet, but I think it's in its final stages, is in work around suicide. So I know they've worked in conjunction with the Samaritans, and they've sort of provided a toolkit, if you like. So after a tragic event like that, it can basically signpost people and give them, to make sure they hit all the areas they need to cover for all that support in that sort of tragic circumstance. So I know that's a bit of work that's been going on for quite a while now, but I think that will come in shortly. So we welcome anything in regards to that, because unfortunately, anyone who's done some time in this service, we all do know friends and colleagues that have taken their own life. So we welcome anything that would support that narrative. I'll mention another new thing that's come out, which, speaking to my colleagues who work with the mental health side, is, in layman's terms, we call it the big red button, but basically there's a system in place now where on the electronic diary at stations, if, for example, there was a traumatic event which they've attended, the officer in charge could potentially just press that button, and straight away all the crew that were in attendance, that will then flag to the CTS, the Counselling Trauma Support, and then they would get contacted. It's also there so someone in private could just decide to, a month later, or go back to something else and just press that button, and again it would trigger that contact to get that support. So we welcome that, because I know in other fire and rescue services they've already had that. And another benefit is, if you have a long career and unfortunately you were to go off with PTSD, well, instead of having to sort of keep explaining and getting upset talking about your experiences, they can just look back at the data, because it's all linked to that big red button. So we welcome that. The only thing we would say, and we have mentioned this to the brigade, is if then that means after pressing that button you're going to get potentially more referrals asking for support from counselling and trauma services, well, you might need more counselling support to help deliver that in an effective way. So I think that's just sort of 2 points I thought I'd mention for you today.
Thank you. And if there may be people who are watching this right now, I know that a lot of the members from the London Fire Brigade are watching, and if there is anyone who is under any distress, there is support available from the Samaritans, a 24-hour line, and other services I know that the London Fire Brigade do provide as well. Anna, you've just arrived. Do you feel like ready to answer the next question, or? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, I'm happy to come to you at the end, or the question is, how do we assess the wellbeing support offered to firefighters in the fire rescue services?
How do we
support wellbeing?
Support wellbeing. So just what generally the issues that we've found, or
I mean, if I give you a moment, I'll go to Deborah, and then that's fine.
I feel like you started a little early, and
no worries, Deborah.
Thank you.
How do we assess the wellbeing support offered?
As you know, I'm an FRS member, so I'm not operational. I'm non-uniformed. But obviously, from my point of view, because I deal with training firefighters, I am aware of, we've got mental health first aiders based at different places within the LFB that you can potentially speak to should you feel that you need that support. We've got mental health first aiders should you need that support at various places within the LFB. We also have a mental health working group now as well. We also, to the side to mental health, we also have learning support advisors who potentially provide support if you've got your neurodiverse, because that can also trigger potential mental health issues if you're anxious or don't feel that you're performing at your best. Say, for example, if you're going for a promotion, can cause you extra stress, and obviously not having the support from learning support potentially affects you if you're neurodiverse. We're looking, and obviously we also have counselling and trauma, which you can self-refer if should you feel that you need that as well. So that's always available to everyone, and we offer that to obviously some of our trainee firefighters when they sometimes find issues during their training. We're now also looking at providing support for officials, because obviously as an official you're dealing with people who may be stressed out or having issues, and when you're having discipline cases, and when you're dealing with that, that can also have an emotional trigger for yourself as the rep. So it's about also supporting everybody who's involved in any cases, whether it's through probation or whether it's through discipline, that we provide that support for them. So we're exploring currently with the LFB about providing support for trade union officials, whether it's around learning support and mental health.
Thank you. And Paula, who's online, you specifically work for the women in the fire service. How would you assess the wellbeing support for the firefighters that you represent?
Thank you. Certainly from Women in the Fire Service, we do welcome the work that's going on with the National Fire Chiefs Council, and we appreciate all the work that's been taken on by fire and rescue services around the country. You said about assessing it, and I think sometimes that can be difficult, and it's just something I wanted to raise, that we do hear narratively quite a lot within Women in the Fire Service, is that sometimes when women are leaving the service, they're not always being necessarily truthful on their exit interviews because they still feel unable to say why they're leaving. So some of that data might not be correct. And I know from what I've been told, some people have suffered with their mental health because of their experiences, and then they felt not able to share that. And something I hear quite a lot is similar to what was touched on earlier, is that people feel unable to say because of how they might be perceived. They might be perceived as weak or not being able to cope or not capable of taking promotion. And we hear a lot about people, especially some of our women in the fire service, feeling they almost need to be all things to all people, and that demands that puts on them both at home and at work, and the pressure that can put them under. So as people were talking, something that just came into my head was around compassion fatigue. And actually it's around enabling we look after the people doing the looking after as well, ensuring that support is there for all. So from our perspective, it'd be quite difficult to quantify how anything's assessed, and it would be individual for each service. But we do welcome the work that is being put in place, and we welcome any further research into this area. We would also just advocate as well, these things that are being done, can we please make sure they're further assessed to make sure they're actually accessible to people and not just there. Actually, let's look at, can people access them? And more importantly, do they feel able to access them? Thank you.
Anna, over to you about any expanding comments from what we've just heard from Paula.
Yeah, so, from Adam as well, it's great that there's a lot of work going into it, but the amount of resources that are available, so if you did contact counselling and wellbeing, you'd be put on a long waiting list. So there are facilities available for people, but it's whether they can access them at that time is the issue I think a lot of people have. And that's, I find, for being the co-chair of the Women in Fire Service London region, is trying to get the information out to people on stations or people that don't work at headquarters. I think that there's still a lot of work to be done there, because how do you reach those people? Because not everybody is logging onto a computer every day. That's not part of their role. They might not log on at all for that whole tour if they're a firefighter. If it doesn't fall for them, they might not do that. So how do we reach out to those people so they know that that support is there, and it's all right for them to do it? And just also about the big red button, that a couple of times we've actually had the call where, so we've been to a traumatic incident and straight away we've had a call from, I can't remember the there's a new terminology, another group that will phone you up and just say, "Are you okay?" Which is a great thing because you don't have to seek it out. They will phone you. So that's really good. But like you said, it might not affect you at the time, but maybe look at it again and you know, a constant review of, are you still okay? You know.
Thank you. Now, the reason that we wanted to feature mental health so strongly within this is that it is very much a part of the way the complaints and misconduct and grievance procedures, you know, seem to be impacting firefighters in such a great capacity in terms of the mental health and what they're going through. We heard it from our previous panel, the impact that those complaint procedures have. We've got our next Assembly member, Clark, who's going to be talking more on this, but do you have something to add, Anna?
Just purely with that, I know that a number of times, so we've got the new PSU, Professional Standards Unit, that will be taking on the grievances, and there's, again, such a backlog of work and time that people that are being investigated or people that are maybe putting in a complaint are waiting a huge amount of time, not hearing anything, and obviously that's going to affect their mental health and like the stress that they're coming under. So I think it's just basically resources and just having more money. That's basically it.
Thank you. We'll move on to Assembly Member Clark.
I really hate to move us on from this topic because it is so important. And as you've said, you know, it's so difficult because you're trying to get information to people, but sometimes when they get the information, it's what's available on the other end once they have the correct information. And it's broader than the fire service, unfortunately, but that's what we're discussing today. Anna, I'll start with you. And I know Gareth has touched on this before, but there's been so much change in society and in the fire brigade, but particularly we're looking at sort of culture change since Nazir Afzal published his report. What changes have you noticed in the LFB?
I think I'm in a slightly different position because of being in a support group and going to different meetings. So I maybe hear more of what the changes are and seeing a different picture. But if you ask me, the person that's sat alone on a fire station that's still having a bit of a troublesome time, maybe they haven't seen anything. But there are changes. We had a number of senior officers come round and they did a number of different talks with us, but that seems to have curtailed a little bit. So it's just a continuous movement. Like I said before, with the Professional Standards Unit, people seeing that people are being are having, you know, almost penance for causing an issue, so that we can actually see that actually they're not just being moved on to a different area or moved on. Just actual full stops of issues. We also said that people would like to see some sort of training if people maybe have been found to have an issue, and then they go under a time frame where they have to behave, but are they actually understanding what their behaviour is? So maybe some sort of having to do some sort of course would be a great way forward, you know, so they could try and get some understanding of why what they've done is not necessarily correct. But there is a positivity around. I feel like there's been a number of initiatives that, particularly around women, to come together, and then so you don't, because we are still quite outnumbered. Sometimes there's like a group of us, but sometimes you can still be the only person in the room. So having the opportunity to come together has been really beneficial. But like I said, that trying to reach out to those people in the stations on their own, how do you reach those people? That's still the quandary I'm at with. So, but yeah.
So can I just come in? If the guests could just make sure that they move their from the base just closer to them when they're speaking, that would be great for the broadcast. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to come on that, sort of just what changes you've seen in that 2 and a bit years since Nazir Afzal published his report?
Okay. There's some bits that are really important to note. And I suppose that comes with a greater lived experience of this service. So, in the Paddington rail crash, as we know, we recently had the 25-year anniversary in 1999. And at that period in time, our counselling and trauma service, I'm not sure if they were bigger or not, but they were ringing people. They were ringing around then, and we were doing this work then. Okay, so it's kind of not to say that we're not doing the right things now, but it definitely slipped somewhere. Definitely slipped somewhere. In 2007, I worked on trying to introduce staff trauma service in another service, following a particularly difficult incident there. And all I was met with was a particularly macho attitude of, we're all right, we're all right, we're all right, nothing to see here, no problems, only for us to accelerate 10 years forward and everybody's telling me they're no longer all right. So, you know, it's this pendulum swing issue that we're having at the moment, I believe. That piece around education, when somebody does something wrong, that's back to where I was talking about that compassion element, about having that open, open conversation, making sure that people understand what's right, the boundaries, the policies, procedures, but also actually understand it. I don't know everyone's lived experience in here until I speak to you. I don't know about cultures. I don't know about people's findings, how they're feelings. And they're all important. Everything's important that we feed off of one another and understand, because we're a humanitarian profession. And the first thing that a firefighter will do when they walk out into the public is they'll glean all the information they possibly can to start making decisions. Yet they don't seem to sometimes be able to do that with one another, which is quite fascinating. And that must be about safety. I'll stop there. Yeah.
This is getting interesting and very philosophical. No, thank you for that. Deborah, I'm going to come to you. Talking earlier about the External Complaints Service and the PSU, how effective do you think that's been since Nazir Afzal?
To be honest, obviously, before the PSU, we went outside to CMP, where they got a lot more cases than they had when it was done internally. So that showed a lack of trust in the internal system. Obviously, now CMP's gone, and we've now gone over to the PSU, and they've got just as many cases, from what I gather. And I don't think they anticipated having as many cases as they have. So we're in a situation where we don't have enough staff to deal with all the cases, so the cases are a lot more protracted than they should be. So people are maybe off on suspension, and it's like a whole year they're off while this thing's going on, and it, as Anna said, their mental health is being affected, and then nothing may come of it, and then they have to wait how long to come back to work as well. So there's that issue, that's from what I'm seeing from my point of view.
Anna, did you want to come in? Oh, you're just nodding along. Okay. Gareth, did you want to come in?
Thank you. Just to add, talk about the impact on mental health. I think that's really important. That the impact on mental health on the person that's made the complaint in the first place, which is never easy to do. The impact on the person who receives the complaint, which is never easy to hear. The impact on the time taken, and the impact on the greater workforce and their faith in that system and their ability to display courage themselves to come forward when they see that it isn't working. And I'm just going to give you a couple of figures here. Employee A was advised in January 2023 that they were to be investigated by the CMP. They were interviewed in March 2023, and in July 2024 they were given a hearing. Nothing found, no case to answer. February 2023, employee B had the same notification, and in July 2023 they received or were interviewed, and in July 24 they were also given a hearing, and there was nothing found. Now, this isn't the whole picture. There are places where things are found, but that timescale, the impact on the faith within the system, the impact on the individuals, all of the individuals, the watches, other managers, the service on the whole, the public, everything is obviously clearly fundamentally flawed in that space. So, after the culture review, we stepped into that new arena, and that is not a good look for anybody. That will not help the service moving forward, and I've had to hold that space with these individuals alongside my other trade union colleagues and other colleagues from other support networks. And that space is really difficult to hold. There's absolutely nothing wrong with holding people to account, as we'll all agree. and there's absolutely right and proper to make sure we do so. But we're also missing opportunities to make sure that we're improving the service by it being flawed in its practice and its application.
I'd just like to add on to that as well, just with a recent meeting with the PSU and some of our members, it was clear that if you make a complaint, or if someone has made a complaint against you, there is no support mechanism there at all. So, like you said, like Gareth said, it's then up to the unions or ourselves to then support that person. And I can say, hand on my heart, I haven't had any formal training in that. I don't know, it might be different for the Fire Brigades Union, but it's something that obviously we were like, what? There's literally nobody just to say, phone them up a week later, are you all right? You know, or someone's gone along and made a very serious complaint, and then they've no one's gone, are you okay to get home? You know, that sort of thing. Just a compassionate, you know, thinking about that actual person rather than writing down the details and then investigating. It's just having a bit of humanity, I suppose, as well.
You can go ahead, Gareth.
Sorry, I told you I'd enjoy this one. One last thing is around this comment around the fire service being a family unit. I kind of just want to sort of draw your attention to that. As a family unit, families accept dysfunction. We're not a family unit. We work together as a team, and teams don't accept dysfunction. They work together to ensure that they give the best version of ourselves in that team.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll hand back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Lots of issues raised within that, particularly on the training question, I think is really important. Thank you. We move on to Assembly Member Hall.
Great, thank you. Can I just come back on something you've said there, Gareth? And you're right, they're not family units, but as you know, I've been to every station, and very often they refer to themselves as family units. That's how that was presented to me on many of the stations, particularly the ones, if I can say, with older members there. And somebody made a comment earlier in the first section about the generational difference, and you commented on how different it was 10 years ago to how it is now. And certainly when I went, it was probably on the outskirts also of London, where they don't get anywhere near as many shouts, and they spend a lot more time together, and lots of the firefighters at that time had been there many years, and the ones that had been there longest took it upon themselves almost to be the father, because they were always men in those positions, the father of the family unit. Do you think that that's going to gradually go anyway, because, you know, people are leaving, and younger people coming in have got different views on how behavioural things should be? Do you think time itself will ease that a bit? Because there's absolutely no question they do regard themselves as family.
Right, okay, so yeah, listen, the institutionalisation, as we might want to call it, might not want to admit to, you know, we can see that even down to the way that London firefighters in particular were trained at Southwark Training Centre. Southwark Training Centre's gone. I'm sure there's probably already a differential about the way they view people that came through a different form of training. The family unit piece was always like, when you go out there, your family, and it was kind of drummed into people. I disagree with it. All of your observations, I would say, are correct, Assembly Member Hall. And actually, I think the answer to the question is strong leadership. Strong leadership sets the tone. A personal friend of mine who retires next week said to me when we were doing something outside of work, if anybody comes to work and is unhappy and does not want to come to work on my watch, then I've failed as a leader. And I think that needs to be, you know, really sort of looked at, because that piece about leadership, the accountability of being a leader, making decisions within policy and procedure, within what's right and proportionate, not your version of it, but what's acceptable to the organisation, because we do see that as well. We see people with differing standards, and then often when we'll end up in some sort of discipline case, we see that the standard was that was applied by the officer, not the standard that's expected by the service. So we have that. But that leadership piece, and this is where it really comes into its own, having the faith to make difficult decisions and hold difficult conversations because you have an understanding of the greater workforce and knowing you will be supported by the senior leadership. That's important. One of the things that we saw a lot of through the CMP investigations was a lot of complaints against middle managers. And a lot of those complaints came out with no case to answer. Was it correct that they were heard? Probably. Was it helpful in some space? Probably not. Because when that's gone on for a year or so, it's really difficult. We end up with the tail wagging the dog. It's a hierarchical organisation. I kind of disagree with that to a degree. I think your initial question, will it eventually phase out? I don't know. I don't know. Because that fire service watch dynamic and the fire service dynamic on the whole, maybe it won't. But 25% of the London Fire Brigade at the moment, I think, have got less than 5 years service. That's quite a significant number. We're seeing quite a few members that are leaving now because there was huge intakes in the middle of the 90s, and a lot of those are gone. I'm going to more retirement functions than I care to mention. So there will be a change, but if we don't get it right now, then we will just continue to propagate poor change.
Yep. No, I agree. I mean, one of my questions was, is there sufficient support given on both sides? You've answered that before I ask it. I think one of the crucial things here is that everything takes so long. I know of some people that have put in complaints. I'm not going to discuss their names with anybody. One of the real issues is the amount of time it has taken to sort out, because it's not just their colleagues, it's also their family at home. I've been contacted by family members of people because they're all pulling their hair out. And I think really support needs to be put in not only for the person making the complaint, but the person that's on the receiving end, because they could well be innocent of what they've been accused of. And yeah.
I suppose if I might just add very quickly, Assemblymember Hawke, one of the issues here is if people haven't got confidence in leading effectively, then we're getting into a position where something that was a very small and easily dealt with situation becomes a complaint, a grievance, an issue. And then that starts to clog things up further and further and further. We have so much courage in the operational arena that we need to see a lot more courage sometimes within our management arena.
Yeah, okay.
And that comes from the senior level as well.
Hearing that loud and clear, does anybody else want to comment?
I was just going to say, I think it all comes back down to training as well. I think there has been some manageable training coming through, but it's very minimal, and that's where people to make people feel more confident in their leadership roles and what they expected. I think that would be really beneficial, so that I'm a sub officer. I haven't actually been on any management training courses yet. So, how do you, I've got an idea of how to be a leader, but having some actual information and guidance would be brilliant. Just talking about the older person in the room, I don't think it's a bad thing if you've got a really good person there that has got the right idea. They're wanting to be there. They've got lots of knowledge, lots of ideas. They're open to teaching the new people. It depends on who that older person is. Not older, but more experienced person, maybe.
Older is fine. Us older ones don't mind
the valued person, but yeah, how the officer in charge is respecting of that person that's got more experience. So you're listening to that person and going, oh yeah, that is a great way of doing something. So it's like a two-way thing.
Yeah, the problem is, of course, the fire service have always used the older people to teach them how to work on the fire station, but it is older people generally that are not so tuned in always. Not as in always, but not always tuned in, I should say, to the way somebody mentioned banter in the earlier session, and we were talking about that, and it would be awful if banter was stopped, but a banter from a younger person is probably going to be slightly different, possibly, from an older person. That's just how it is, and we have to face up to that.
I think, like you say, that is societal change. Like, as people move on and new generations come through, you see that in society day to day, don't you? That there's a generational change of what people is acceptable. So I think it will change, but I think it's just going to take a long time for changes to come.
Yes, and we are pushing it along, hoping it will finish earlier. With you here, Anna, can I ask you what further measures could support women firefighters if they experience bullying and harassment on the fire station? And I hope things have changed from having units that you sleep in underneath the stairs, as I think it was in Kingston, and places like that I've seen that used to be terrible.
But yeah, that there are facilities, you know, and it's not just for women. Privacy for all is a great thing for everybody on stations. I know that's been rolling out. And I'd say majority of people are respectful of that. You know, there are the odd cases where people are still using the females' facilities. If there's no female on station or on that watch, then they'll think that's free game. You're looking for support that people. I think it's really just like how the problem I have or question I have is how do you reach those people that have got an issue? Say somebody that's not been in that long, doesn't know about all the different support groups or all the different information, doesn't know who to ask because maybe they work on a watch full of males and they haven't had an issue with that before. So how did you get that information to people? And that's the question I have as well. How do I try and reach out to those people to let them know we are here and we can support them if they need?
Well, hopefully you'll find an answer to that, so that you do, because the brigade must be relying on you doing that. So you would be the support mechanism, really, for women in the service?
Yeah, so we are. So Women in the Fire Service is a support group for anybody that works in the fire service. So be that, you know, operational, in control, fire safety, anybody at all can be part of it. We are just a support group. We've also got the Women's Action Committee, which is part of the FBU, which is a very strong organisation, and they will help people, operational women. So I know that they've helped hugely with a number of cases that are going through at the moment, because they are a trade union and they have different powers than we are. Just a support group of volunteers.
Perhaps it should be impressed upon female firefighters at the training stage.
Yeah, that is something
right
we did
from the very
like
beginning.
An onboarding thing,
because
they
are very much in the minority, and I suspect always will be. There are some services or trades or professions or whatever that one sex or other will gravitate to, and whether people think that that's right or wrong, I don't care. It's a fact. It may change over the years, but it is generally a fact. So if I can ask all of you, His Majesty's Inspectorate recommended introducing a national barred list to prevent firefighters dismissed for misconduct from applying for another role. Do you support this, and why? Shall I start with Deborah this time, because I left you out last time, Deborah, unintentionally. Is there something?
Do I support it? I think, obviously, depending on what reason they've been barred, I think potentially yes, they shouldn't be employed by the LFB. But obviously, there's also the other issue of, were you a young person? As you know, young people can do things that they wouldn't do when they're older, when they've got more common sense and have more control over their emotions. So do you bar somebody forever who did something when they were 16? But obviously that's
not... where would you put the line? This is the issue, isn't it?
So it also, so for me, it depends on what it is. I wouldn't just blanketly say anybody who's ever had a conviction could never join the LFB.
Okay, Anna. Would you bar, if somebody's barred, would you stop them becoming...
So they've been suspended from another brigade?
Yeah,
Then, I'd say if there's grounds for them to be suspended, then, yeah.
Yep. Gentlemen, have you a view?
Yeah, I think, obviously, if they've been sacked from one service, then it's not going to be an easy thing to then go into another service, because there must have been a significant reason for that matter. Not to pass it over, but I know I did speak with Gareth, my colleague, on this, and he's got, I think, a couple of angles on this one, which is interesting.
There's complexities. Yeah,
There always are,
As you
Gareth.
would imagine, there are complexities, and the complexities, I think, is in the detail. We talk about that granular detail. You know, what are we looking at here? When we're talking about a barred list, are we talking about somebody who's lost their job because of something that's happened in their personal life? They've got a criminal conviction, which has then resulted in the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act being put in place, and they've passed that period. Or we talk about someone who's done something absolutely heinous within an organisation and should never be allowed near public service again. Hard to know. Needs a lot of debate. Would broadly agree, though, that if somebody is found, well, there's no other way of putting it, if somebody is found guilty of doing something that's absolutely heinous within the Fire and Rescue Service, then it sends out a very clear message that A, it's not welcome, and B, we don't welcome you back. And I don't really see a problem with that, if I'm honest, because we do not sit with those values of anyone who would do anything that would contravene that. However, it could be open to abuse, and that's, as a trade unionist, I've spotted
It could either way. I mean,
exactly.
You've got to be pretty bad, I would think, to be on the barred list. And Paula, online, I'm so sorry, because you're not in front of me, but can I ask you this question? Somebody's been barred nationally. What do you think?
Thank you. Yeah, on behalf of women in the fire service, I'll be honest, this isn't something we've explored or discussed, so it wouldn't be right of me to comment on behalf of all members. But I think certainly from our perspective, as we've spoken about this morning, we'd like to see measures, be in education and information, put in place to stop us even getting to that point where we're looking at that. I think in terms of a barred list, yes, if people are going against values and behaviours, obviously they're not the type of people we want to advocate or see within the fire and rescue service. I just think we need to be holistic when we think about things and look at things in full. As we've seen, a number of things have been publicly put across social media and in the media of late, and we do need to consider if someone's name is explicitly put out there in relation to something, it will have implications on not just themselves but other people within their family also.
Okay, fine. Thank you very much. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. I just want to end this particular segment on complaints and misconduct with a question to the union. I mean, in your honest opinion, do you think currently the PSU is fit for purpose at the moment, when we do have individuals who have gone perhaps through a procedure and maybe the complaints process hasn't been adequate, and yet we've seen situations where a particular individual firefighter may actually end up working in another segment or another area, another department, and there's just feels like there's no justice for some individuals who've gone through that process. What would you say on that point? We'll start with Gareth.
Right. Is it... Again, to be objective and to be fair, we have to look at the amount of time it took to introduce the PSU during that period of time that they were looking to introduce it through the CMP piece, and where we are now, the distance travelled and the resources that they've found that they've needed. We're on a journey, I think, is the only way we can look at it. I know that there's recommendations that there should be professional standards units everywhere. What my concern is that the PSU just becomes HR rebranded. That's a big concern of mine. You know, we can't just rebrand something. If you want to make something unique, I always believed that a professional standards unit should have been autonomous. It shouldn't be in headquarters. It should be somewhere else, somewhere entirely different, and it should be governed in a different way, because one of the criticisms of fire and rescue services is that they kind of did their own housekeeping. So then we've put a professional standards unit in our own house. Okay, so there's questions there that I would ask. Because it's new and because they're learning as they go, I have fears that it's created more difficulty. So rather than actually putting together a specific task force to deal with what was expected, and that could have been pulling in resources of various middle managers and giving them the correct levels of training to make sure that they understood what they needed to do in terms of investigations and discipline. You know, we went to CMP, we said, look, we don't trust ourselves. I think that was a bit
Just to use the word trust, I think that's really important. Do you think there is trust in that process?
I think I think in some ways, we commit an act of self-harm. You know, there is an awful lot of ability. We've got blue light collaboration, which whether we've used that effectively or not in this space, I'm not sure. I'm sure it's been looked at. But in terms of the minute that we sort of took it outside of trusting our officers on station, trusting our people off station and saying, actually, do you know what? The culture review says none of you are good enough, so we're going to go to this, because that's how it's interpreted. Let's be clear about that. Whether it says it or not, that's the interpretation. We then get almost a broad brush feel of, well, I'm not good enough, so over to you. And the minute that we did that, we disempowered our leaders as well to a degree. So I think unintended consequences were mentioned earlier. And I think there have been a lot of unintended consequences in this process so far. However, we're in it, so we've got to keep moving forward. That's where I'll be on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd as a union would agree it's still a work in progress. And as Anna mentioned as well, I think after the amount of work and cases that happened with CMP, I think everyone would think there would be maybe not a massive reduction, but there would be like a noticeable reduction. But I think the levels of complaints coming in, and it isn't all bullying and harassment complaints, but there is a high level of complaints still that they're having to deal with. And I think it's that amount of work which is causing the biggest frustrations to our people, which is things do take long to play out. I mean, I'll give you sort of, without mentioning names, I'll give you sort of examples of things that can happen and that they deal with or what our members go through, etc. But, for example, there was a case of someone suspended for nearly a year. They got their letter saying, no case to answer, thank you very much. But on that same day, they got another letter saying, another complaint's come in, you're now resuspended. And obviously that's, as Gareth mentioned, that it's because they're evolving, it would be best practice for, if there's someone's making complaints, well, you need to make them all at the same time, because otherwise some people keep it in their back pocket and it just keeps the whole circle going round, and that's something that we're mindful of. I will say that they do want to try and give it back to local managers when it's a lower level issue, because I know, for example, say two firefighters had a disagreement and had words, so to speak. It went up to the PSU, but I think if CMP was still in place, that could have resulted in another stage 3 and all that work that goes around it. But the PSU looked at it and said, actually, we'll give this back down to the local management chain and they can deal with that. So I think even though the PSU's there, I think we still have to remind, and we've always been on about more training for managers to give them that confidence, because I think sometimes they're scared of making a decision in case they then get a complaint about that decision. So there's sort of two areas that need sort of bolstering. But as I say, I do meet regularly with the PSU and we do have conversations, and we have had some meaningful conversations on certain topics which do need improvements. I'll refer to drugs and alcohol policy. I think, and we've had that conversation where before drugs and alcohol policies, right, you've done that, you're now getting in trouble, or we're now going to test you now, and then you're in trouble. Unfortunately, the amount of firefighters that we come into contact with that are suffering with PTSD, that a lot of the time they will try and cope through drink or drugs. Yeah, so we are having discussions where we want to try and put improvements into that policy just to give the support and make it more nuanced, so it's not a big stick. It's actually realising that our workforce do encounter a lot of traumatic events, and we can't be so rigid to just punish people if they do unfortunately opt for those sort of things. So I mean, I'll give you one just example how things have played out. Sometimes someone's actually gone to their manager and said, oh, I'm really struggling and I might take something. Well, instead of putting in the support there and then, they then got the testers down to come and test them. So I think we just need a bit more focus on this, and we will be having discussions going forward on that policy, etc., because through the complaint system and stuff, drugs and alcohol is actually one of the trends that's going up. So I thought I'd just mention that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your honesty as well. We're moving on to the next segment, which is on toxic watch culture. Back to Assembly Member Hall.
Thank you. Can I just come back on something, and perhaps you'll be able to absolutely say this isn't right. Is there a slight problem with the middle management on the basis, and it could have changed since I last really looked into it, we have so many people in the fire brigade, in the London Fire Brigade, whose sisters, fathers, uncles, we have so many relatives in there that know each other, that know who they've worked with, so bringing the family type thing back in again. But there are so many people that know each other. And then if they're suddenly going from being on the watch to being, you know, to being higher and then in managerial, they're then having to try and discipline their father's mate or their son's best mate, or because I noticed this as I was going round, that the number of people that said, "Oh yeah, my brother said he saw you last week," or you know, does that bring a different sense of complexity into managing? Because if you work for a company, as it were, there's, you know, you go out for more staff and there's external people coming in all the time. Whereas it does keep rolling round with a hell of a lot of people. You've only got to go on Twitter, and I'm very proud of my son. He became a firefighter today. And I mean, that's just a silly example, but actually it happens in the London Fire Brigade. Can't speak for the other brigades, all the time. And to discipline your brother's mate, your father's, your uncle, whatever, must add a different layer of complexity to disciplining people below you. What do you think? I'll ask the union.
Wow. As someone who's been a borough commander, I suppose I can talk about this.
Is your entire family in the brigade?
No. Although
I was actually joking.
No, I did have family at Clerkenwell, but that was at the turn of the last century. So I mean, look, there's a couple of pieces to that. So I just made a note when we were talking a little moment, and I'll just bring this out. Without proper training, we create imposter syndrome, leading to more mental anguish, okay, at middle managers. So this is where we are. I think without training people, they're not sure what to do. I've just heard that. I've not had this leadership training. I'm not 100% sure what to do. What do I do with this? And sometimes it might be that we turn to other colleagues who go, well, I don't know what to do with that either, but this is what I've done historically. So there's that part of it. So that's a complexity. Culture eats discipline for breakfast. There was a phrase I heard recently from an area commander in another service. And actually, what I'll say is, what could be identified as a negative, and I think this was brought up with the last panel, in that families and friends and relatives and people you've worked with, you may look on more favourably if you were put in a position to discipline them, or you may find it more complicated. I'll actually put it to you that works in a slightly different way, where the person who's committed an offence takes it in a much harder way, because they feel that they've embarrassed themselves, their colleagues, their peers, and they present themselves in a way that says, I'm really sorry I've done this, and actually there's a lot more learning from that.
Yeah, fair point. Fair point. So it can work both ways. Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay, sorry, Chairman, I will go on to toxic watch culture. So, Anna and Paula, I'm going to ask this of you. So the question is, how can toxic watch culture be tackled effectively? And at this point, I must point out, not all watches are toxic by any stretch of the imagination. But the question stays, how can we, where it applies, be tackled? Shall we go to Paula first? Because I feel Paula's being left out, and I'm sorry about that.
Thank you, Assembly Member Hall. Yeah, I mean, it's been such an interesting conversation, and this is something I feel quite strongly about. You know, not just representing women in the fire service, but I am in the fire service still myself. I've worked across free fire and rescue services, and I've been in nearly 24 years. And what I would say is, there's no doubt, yes, there is some issues with toxicity on watches. We've seen that it's played out in media and recent reports. But I also say there is a place for that watch culture. And as someone that was part of a fatal fire where 2 of my colleagues sadly lost their lives, actually that environment with a watch that was supportive and was there to help each other through that time and for many years later was actually paramount, and it had its place. So I think we need to be conscious of looking at both sides. However, in response to some of the toxic activities that go on, especially around comments, which is the one I hear a lot, we keep going back to this education for people, and really around a safe space. I think being able to have those conversations and create an environment where we feel able to speak up. And I think that's very much led from our watch managers. Actually, certainly for women in the fire service, when they know they have allyship and they know that someone's going to listen to them and support their perspective and view, it is so powerful. So we do advocate the bravery of those speaking up. But we talked as well about the evolution of time and watches. And I think it's about us being self-aware ourselves and being open. I know as a 19-year-old that joined the fire service, things I found funny then and probably took part in, I wouldn't now. We've moved on societally. I'm a different person to I was then. I think as well it's understanding that we have different issues now we may have in the past. And actually it can be quite hard for watchers to move with those times, especially if that watch is quite static. So something I think that's come about, or certainly I felt for me, is I did stay on my watch quite a long time. And I found it quite hard for people to not see me as the 19-year-old that I joined at. And actually, I've moved on. Things that were maybe a joke when I joined around menopause, etc., that I hadn't considered myself because I didn't have to, became quite difficult to maybe try and talk about later when it was an issue, because we weren't necessarily evolving or moving with society and with that rate of change. So regards to toxic culture, I think it has to be led from the top and from watch managers or watch officers. We need to create an environment where we are comfortable having these conversations. We're comfortable to challenge, but as previously been discussed, not everything has to go straight to a disciplinary. Actually, let's have those conversations first, understand each other's lived experience and why something might have happened. I think as well, it's just being open to listening to each other and understanding why these cultures have evolved, what's led to that. And I know possibly later we might talk about rotation of watches, and that's a conversation in itself. But for me, in terms of how it can be managed effectively, it needs to be managed at all levels, but it's being open to those conversations, and we need to stop this mentality of it doesn't happen on my watch. Because actually, if we all hold the mirror up to ourselves and look, it probably is happening more than we realise. But if we're not allowing people to speak out, we're never going to really take the opportunity to look within.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you so much for that, Anna.
I fully agree with everything that she said. I think she said it very, very well. The only point I'd like to add is just having, when somebody does speak up, that they're not victimised and then moved to a different station, because then they're like, oh, they're the troublemaker, they're the person that spoke up. Having that support system around them, and they're not the one to be forced to move because they've caused the issue.
Yeah, that's a very good points, aren't they? Thank you both. That was interesting. Right, the next question. Is the London Fire Brigade doing enough to rotate watches to prevent the toxic watch culture being embedded, which is something that Paula touched on there. So if I start with the FBU, then I'll come to Anna.
I'll just be honest. Actually, I've never.
Always be honest, Adam.
I've never heard this. I've never heard this term. I've never heard this term rotating watches. Obviously, I can gather what it may mean, but I mean, I think we should be in a place where watchers can self-regulate or individuals can speak up, which I think does happen more. People are more comfortable to challenge. But it has happened 20 years ago if there was a problem on a watch, because sometimes a label will be it's the whole watch, but it might just be one or two on that watch, but they might just be like the biggest characters, so then the whole watch sort of gets the same label. But I think there's still that facility if they've done wrongdoing and it's going to help, then those people can get moved. That's something that's happened historically. I don't see if there needs to be this new rotation of watches. I think that could just cause a multitude of well-being issues for everyone involved. And I think even the term toxic watch culture, I think it's harmful in a way, because people from the outside, if they hear this in the media, and that they think that every fire station is like a battleground, and they're not. And they're not. So I appreciate when you said that, Assemblymember Hall, that it's a minority, and it is. But yeah, I think I'll go to Gareth, see what his take is now. But as I say, I've never even heard that term before.
Okay, Gareth, I have heard the term before. Is it just something that's spoken about and doesn't happen?
Yeah, I think
is
so.
It?
Yeah, I think it is.
Interesting.
Yeah. I think. Yeah, unless we're in that space, yeah, you're quite right, unless it's about disbanding. But there's always going to be a natural rotation in some respect, because we're going to change officers, we're going to change through skills, we're going to all these bits that will happen. I think the fire service should be a meritocracy. It should be, as much as you put in, you know, you are valued at what you put in. You can't just turn up and expect everything to be given to you. You can't just turn up and expect to be a difficult person and it will just contend with you. You know, you have to bring your best self to work, as we've discussed, all right? And in terms of watch rotation, I can think for a moment how many fantastic London Fire Brigade watches serve in their own communities, that have been embedded within that community, that have made huge tangible differences and continue to do so day after day, whether that be through their actual professional duties or going out and doing charitable duties in their own bits and pieces in the community. That's beyond anything that anyone could hope for. It's great value, so the value of it's huge. If a watch is dysfunctional, or if a watch requires what we're calling a rotation, there are a lot of questions to be asked as to how we've got to that space. And this is what we talked about earlier, about the difficult conversations. What does that character look like? How does it happen to that? In terms of the broad picture, do we rotate watches? I think it was in the 90s that the Metropolitan Police went somewhere along the lines of you could only do 5 years in any specialism, and then you were moved, and then you were moved, and then you were moved. And it didn't work.
Of course not.
Didn't work. So that's another very big debate.
So perhaps then, when you've got, I mean, you mentioned, Anna, if a watch has got a couple of really big characters. Well, we know when a watch has got a couple of big characters or one very dominant character, then other people sort of pale into the background and maybe aren't listened to more. Because I have seen that. I have seen that when they would only speak to me on watch if the person in charge indicated that they could do that. And I've sat there, well, they've all sat like that at me. I carried on regardless, but they sat like that at me, and only could they relax when the one in charge said they could. Now, you know, I've been to very many watches, and as I say, this isn't the norm by a million miles. But if you get a watch that has got a couple of very big characters in it, can that be a cause for what some could say is a toxic culture? And would there be reason then, instead of to rotate, to maybe take that watch and break that watch up? What's your view on that? Yeah, Anna.
I would say having a big character on the watch can be fantastic. It can be brilliant. It can bring people together. They can bring life to the watch, you know, let's get moving, let's get going, let's go to the next event, you know. That can be a great thing, or like you said, it can be a very difficult thing if they don't align with everybody else and they're intimidating, aren't letting people flourish underneath them. But to disband or rotate a whole watch is fantastically difficult, because it takes a long time to gain trust with the people that you work with, and understand who you can rely on to do certain things, and to then just be disbanded to completely different watches, completely different areas, even if London is so big, if you transfer from like blue to green, you won't know anyone.
Yeah.
Because it's just so big, so you might know the odd person, but so then you're having to make those relations again, understanding where your role is in that, because you've got to fit in, so that you're a good part of the team. So I imagine it'd be hugely challenging for anybody to go through that.
I think we've just had, it's certainly within our thoughts that was beginning, rotation was beginning to happen. Tell me, are the complaints that are coming through, I don't know if you get cited, well, you must get cited some, any of them connected to what some would call a toxic watch, or things within that? I mean, I can think of a couple of cases where it was, without mentioning names. I mean, what's your view on that? If you get quite a few complaints come in, or if the fire brigade get complaints coming in, and they are quite a few have come from a specific watch, then surely at that point there must be a question around whether the dynamics within that watch need to be rotated or changed.
In conversations with the PSU and from the data that I get, and talking of data, it's something that's been sort of an ongoing issue as a FBU and liaising with the PSU, is being able to get a real good oversight of the complexity of the data, because currently I've got some tool that's I'm using that they give me access to, but I think they were bringing in a newer IT system to deal with that subject, and it was going to be very, very good, but as of yet it hasn't come online, or it's not up to what they were hoping at the moment. So that would give greater detail, but I'm not aware of, for example, as you speak, where it's like multiple people on one watch doing it. I know there has been complaints with more than one person sort of thing involved. I know that, but I haven't got the detail to say there was 6 from one watch being complained about. I haven't seen that in the data that I've got access to.
Fair enough, but it's something that should be watched, because if that does come up, then that must put a red flag up there for something to be done.
Yeah, I'd like to think so, and as I say, if they do get this improved data capture tool, then I'd be able to see that myself, hopefully. But yeah, I'm sure they would definitely make a note of that. How they react, I don't know. But
okay, well, I can only say I hope they speed up this whole situation. I mean, it's the same with the police. When people are accused of things, it needs to be sorted ASAP for the sake of everybody. People bring it in, people at the other end of it, and everybody's families in the meantime.
I think just to, you're right, absolutely 100%. And I think it was mentioned with the last panel that the Assembly's got a huge responsibility to play with that as well. And I know you know that. But that holding our senior leadership to account and asking those questions is so important, and it helps us as well to move things along. So just to be clear on that one, that
well, it's why we're doing the investigation.
So important.
Thank you.
So important.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, can I add something?
Yes, absolutely.
My issue is that obviously if you've got a toxic watch, even if it does mean breaking people up, if you're working in that condition, under those circumstances, you're probably not working as effectively as you could be if you were in a happy watch. So for me, I'd be more concerned about, I wouldn't be concerned about splitting people up, I'd be more concerned about people not functioning as effectively because they're not happy and they're just tolerating negative behaviours.
Absolutely right. How are you supposed to do the job if you're constantly worried and anxious about what you're doing, and if you're going to be going through these processes. Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Sorry, just one last point. Sorry to add on to. I know you want to move on, but it's not going to be the whole watch, like you said. It's the person. But then if that person is moved, they might then have a flag on them to say, oh, they were moved. So there could be connotations to an innocent person being moved as well. So it's how do you regulate that?
It's a really interesting point. Thank you. Thank you so much. We are going to be moving on to the next section, which is on diversity inclusion, and we have less than around 20 minutes to do this. So we may not ask the questions to all the panel guests. Thank you. Assembly Member Polanski.
Thanks. Just to know as well from what Assembly Member Hall said, it was my impression too that watches were rotating, because we've had a whole conversation, I think, with senior leadership about do you move the perpetrator, do you move the survivor, like, so...
There's a disconnect.
I think we need to come back to that with them. Diversity and inclusion. So if I can start with you, Deborah, obviously it's a huge subject, and I think me and the chair are going to tag team it a little bit. But just to kind of ask you a very broad question, which is, we were talking about gap analysis in the first panel, like where are the gaps right now? Where could the London Fire Brigade be more inclusive as an employer in a workplace, in your opinion?
I still believe, looking at the structure of the LFB and who's in what grades and what ranks, there's still, especially if you're reflecting London, that we don't reflect London. And for me, there are still issues around promotions, employment, who's sitting where within the LFB. As you mentioned, there's still, although you say not a family, there's still that, because of that connections, there's certain people that will get promoted more than some other people left out of what's going, of the promotion possibilities. And obviously, if you haven't got diversity within the different grades and ranks, how do you affect the changes that you want to see? How do you reflect them? If everybody at the top or even in the middle are all potentially white Caucasian males, how do you... And also, if they're considering different policies, how do they then bring in other people's viewpoints? How do they reflect those? Even if you do an EDI, equality impact assessment, if you've got nobody there to speak from a woman's point of view or a black person's point of view, how do you reflect that within that?
Thank you, that's really clear. I mentioned earlier too that the Met Police are now looking to be an anti-racist organisation actively. Would you like to see the London Fire Brigade make a similar commitment?
Yeah, I believe so, yes. It's not, from my point of view, it's not good enough just to say, I'm not a racist. If you're just going to sit there and let somebody else be racist who is your colleague, because I'm only responsible for myself, you've also got responsibility to the other members of your team and to challenge people's behaviours. So it's not about, I'm not racist, I'm all right. No, it's because of that I was working in equality and diversity training back in 2000 when we used to go out and do a lot of equality and diversity training, and this is now 24 years later and we're still having the same conversation. So being just saying I'm not racist is not good enough. You have to be anti-racist and be able to challenge and speak up.
Thanks, Deborah. Anna, building on this, obviously all of these issues intersect, so the questions are building, so feel free to comment on the previous question, but particularly for female firefighters. What steps have been taken to make the fire and rescue services more generally more inclusive, and what steps do you still think need to be taken?
I think there's been a lot of good work done, but it has been specific, like groups helping out. So the ESG groups have been doing a number of different events. I know that from headquarters there have been certain things that they're trying to involve, like there's been different training courses and trying to push and find out why particularly women don't want to go up the ranks, and what is the stumbling block, and is it the confidence, is it training, is it imposter syndrome, like, I'm just not that good. So there has been some work to do that, but it's also, I think people are very aware that they don't want to be singled out, like you can get through because, so you want to be seen to have done well, you want to be seen to be the person that's right for the fit, rather than, we'll get you through because we want you in this position. So it's having a transparency that people have had the correct training and the correct confidence, So there is work that needs to be done there. But I think it's great that these conversations are open, and there is a two-way with the senior management with that.
And I was about to ask that. So do you feel like senior management are listed, so you could say to them, we need more training to have confidence?
So we, for women in the fire service, we've had a meeting with the commissioner, and he's very open to listening to what we would like to do in the next year, with different training, things that we've put on. And how they can support us, and we do have allies with our senior. So Fiona Dolman is our one of our allies. But I'm just going back to a point. It's great to say I'm an ally, but what actually does that mean?
Right.
And she does do things. I'm not going to say that she doesn't. But just having more, you always want more. But people are obviously very busy in their job as well. So there's a lot of things that they have to do, and to be help with support groups and women in fire service is another addition to their workload. So
thanks. Paula, if I can come to you. So it's really all the questions I've just asked from your perspective.
Thank you. Just touching on what Anna has said there, certainly women in the fire service advocate, see it and be it. It's about role modelling. But one thing I did want to raise on that, which probably gets overlooked sometimes, is the pressures on people when they are the first to do something. I've certainly found myself in that position, and it feels like all eyes are on you. You feel like you can't do anything wrong. And I think it's around having that support for people as well. And sometimes recognising if a service itself isn't in that place, then that's where we need to reach out to other services, can reach out to women in the fire service, but make sure that not just allyship, but support, mentoring and coaching or peer support is there as well. Anna touched as well on confidence, and certainly I can say from the development weekends that are carried out by women in the fire service, that is a theme that comes up an awful lot. I've helped with facilitating incident command for quite a few years, and that is certainly an area where people will come and speak to me about they just don't feel confident to give it a go. And actually the feedback afterwards, when we've created a really safe space with supportive people where it's okay to get it wrong because it's a learning environment is created, people actually thrive. And I think the most lovely thing for me has been when people have come back and said, based on that, I then went and gave it a go, and actually I got that crew manager, watch manager position, which is absolutely wonderful. There can be an awful lot put on networks. Anna's touched on this, and I think sometimes we need to be careful that people that are volunteering in these roles to support services are also looked after and supported, and don't end up doing above and beyond what they have capacity to do, because that needs to be factored into their well-being as well. And if we use the term carrying water, can take a load for other people. So we just need to make sure that well-being support is around. And then just going back to your original question, just around EDI, and I was just writing some notes as we were speaking, and thoughts I had were just around cultural competence, but that continuous learning. So if we reflect on some of our conversations earlier, if we're going to put the education and teachings in place or learning, then it can't be a tick box. It can't be an online session, tick box, done. The world moves on, society moves on, the services move on, and we need to stay current, because actually what was current a few years ago won't be current now. So it's about continuously moving with the times to make sure that we are where we need to be.
Thanks, Paula. That's very much been a theme. If I can finish off with Adam and Gareth. Essentially, this question more widely, what's missing, but also if I could ask you to address neurodiversity as well. I know that's a key aspect of this too. What's happening in that space?
I'll try and cover some of the earlier points and then quickly move on to that, because I know we're pushed for time now. But I'll just agree with Deborah, and as a trade union and the FBU, we do have an anti-racism stance, so I'm totally in agreement with that. In diversity, I think in recruitment side, I think more can be done looking at different avenues to reach more of the community. One thing as the union, especially in London, we've raised for the last couple of years, to be honest, with LFB management, is the fact of by stipulating that you need a driving licence to join LFB, that's a major barrier for young people, especially in the city. So even this week, actually, we did speak with the Commissioner on this, and I think they are going to look at that and find ways around it, because it is a barrier. And if there was something that could be done so you didn't need that initially, but you could gain it while you're in service, I think that would attract a lot more diversity to LFB. Neurodiversity, well, as I say, I know LFB does quite a bit in that space, and even as a FBU now, they're doing a lot more now, and we're even talking of having possibly a section, as you would with this other support groups. So, yeah, a lot is going on in that space. I haven't got the detail really to give you, but I know it's literally way up there, and I think it's a bit like where good culture is happening. People are talking more, where before, if someone was neurodiverse, they're never going to tell anyone. I hope anyone doesn't notice, but now people go, oh, well, that's because of my ADHD, or that's because of that. So people are actually having them open conversations now, where before, 25 years ago, someone might have been using the term dug out for being slightly different, but now actually people, because it's talked about much more, actually they understand that actually some people do have these isms, and there's a reason for it, and I think people do treat people better accordingly to that. So that's as much as I know on that.
That's
really
helpful. It's a continuous learning we're just talking about. Can I ask on the driving licence, is that a statutory thing, or is that a London Fire Brigade thing, or do you know where that's coming from?
Well, as far as I'm aware, it's a London Fire Brigade thing.
Okay.
You need that to...
Helpful, thank you.
Just going on to the people with different neurodiversities, again, it comes down to lack of training on the station, and people come and they've been to training school and they've gone through and they've got a plan of how they can adaptations and stuff, and that hasn't been passed on to the watch. So then you're completely wrong-footed because you don't know how the best way to help train that person, because obviously it's a continuous training when they join with you on that watch. So I know that there was talk of that, having a better seam from handover from training to the watch, but I don't know if that's actually come about yet. So that is something that did really need to be looked at.
Thanks, Anna. Gareth, there was about 25 issues there.
No, I mean,
anything to add?
So many good points raised, and so much to learn. I mean, talking about delivering equalities training 24 years ago, and how there's still this feeling of quite a long way to travel. I hear this a lot, by the way, and it's absolutely tantamount to my original point. We need to listen to each other. And it's that piece of education, this safe space to speak, which we've all created in here today, which is fantastic, needs to go out. And that's what I would say. I mean, Adam said something inadvertently, but he said, if I can be honest, right? Inadvertently said, if I can be honest. But there is a sign there. And the sign is that there is a fear of speaking out. There is a fear of being vulnerable. Okay? So that courage in vulnerability is the takeaway I would take from today. To be able to say how you feel, to be able to say how you're feeling, to be able to say how you feel something impacts you, as we all know, takes a huge courage. And to be vulnerable in that space usually takes quite a few years and a bit of wisdom. But we haven't got that ability to give people a very junior level of service coming in, who've lived through the pandemic and coming in at those young ages. We need to be able to afford them that ability. And also, then it doesn't go straight round that pendulum swing to, oh no, what's happening there? We need to be in a space where we understand that just as we used to train people to, I don't know, do the inventories that we do, that we need to be able to train people to speak to one another, to understand one another, and more importantly, to move forwards with agility as a team.
It feels like a societal thing, not just a rescue thing. Thanks, Chair.
The only thing I'm thinking, if anybody is watching, they'll think, why on earth do they need a driving licence? About 8 years ago, the brigade was in a dire position because we did not have enough people to drive the vehicles, and it was desperate, and that is why there is that condition on. I'm just mindful that there are people watching this thinking, why on earth would a firefighter need a driving licence? So just for clarity.
Thank you. So many points in terms of training, I think, has really come through here, particularly on EDI, but also I just wanted to make a point on training for mentors as well, specifically. And is this something that has come up in terms of, been raised with you in terms of the union?
Yeah, I mean, there's constantly training of mentorships, bits and pieces, and things put in place, especially following some of the reviews that were of recent years around the way that firefighting development go out to borough and on station. I suppose I'm going to come back to my colleague Deborah's point, is that these things aren't new. And actually we need to look at why they don't work. But also
that consistency, we were talking about it in the last panel, the need for consistency, because when it comes to mentors, not everybody has a mentor and not every watch has it. There's still this these differences throughout the fire brigade.
Yeah.
That is the problem.
And I'll also add to that, what if you give somebody the title of mentor, what does that actually involve?
Yeah, thank you. Just on the terms of, you were talking about learning, Gareth. This process that we're doing, we're obviously going to be making recommendations for the London Fire Brigade, but do you feel that this process and this learning can even reflect within the Fire Brigade Union itself?
Absolutely. I think one thing I would say is that the Fire Brigade Union only exists because of the people that the Fire Brigade employs. You know, we are those people. We're employed by the fire service. We come through there, and you know, okay, there's been, the drive, if you like, to stand up on behalf of others, or maybe you've got those skills, or maybe you just feel that you need to do it. Whatever it looks like, the impact on people for doing that is huge. There's a great book actually by Dr. Tim Cantifer called "Depression: The Curse of the Strong." If the Assembly's got time to read it, it would be a very good book to read.
Firefighters are looking for you to not just only to trust you, but you've got to be a model as well.
Absolutely.
Of what, be what you preach.
Absolutely, and also we have to do that without fear. And actually, I think one of our colleagues, John, always used to say to me that nothing good comes from being a trade union official.
Absolutely. Deborah, I'm just going to leave the last words with you, because we've been talking a lot about the firefighters themselves, but this also really does relate heavily to the non-operational staff as well. Do you have any final comments on the need for maybe the training or the approach that we have on all these issues about diversity and inclusion?
Are we still looking at the neurodiversity? Yeah. Okay. Well, from what I know, because obviously I deal with, although I'm FRS, I deal with training firefighters. We do have a learning support team. So, if you have any neurodiversity, you can approach them, and they will assess you. They can also send you to an external provider who actually can give you a full assessment. And also, they've also recently created what we call an adjustment passport, and that is there for what learning adjustments you put in place for any individual, and they can share that with their line manager. Also, training firefighters, when they now go out, there's a report, and it also will tell the station, the receiving station, that they potentially have any neurodiversity, and they also then, the learning support will contact them to sort of bridge that gap from them going out from training into the station. So from a FRS point of view, obviously that's less important, but we still obviously have the same passport that we can then share with our managers. And I think on our side, we're less likely to not say that we're neurodiverse, if you know what I mean. We're not as worried about telling people that we're neurodiverse, so therefore we'll approach for all that support that we require and put that in place for us when we go out
you so much. We are now at the end of this really interesting meeting. Thank you so much to all the guests who have joined us in person and online, and your contributions have been incredibly important. And if there is anything that you want to add, again, we will be writing to you, so do give us your thoughts if there's anything else that you want to contribute. We do have a few short items of business just before we conclude. Can we note the report and today's discussion? Noted. Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with the party group lead members to agree at any output for the discussion? Can the committee note its work programme? Noted. Thank you. Now, and again, thank you to all the members of the committee and the Assembly members who did a fantastic job. And I really do hope that we come up with some recommendations that make a difference. So thank you so much. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 3rd of December 2024 at 10 o'clock in the chamber in City Hall. Thank you.